Hey, how you doing, everybody? It's Bad Brad, and today's topic is pawn shop guitars. You know, when you're looking for an instrument or you're looking for deals, sometimes pawn shops can be the place to go. All right, what I have here, this is a Gibson Firebrand. It says the SG Standard. Now, obviously, this I bought from a pawn shop down the street here in Madison, Tennessee. I believe it's called Barry's Jewelry and Loan. And I used to go down to that pawn shop once a week and find, see what they had. And most of the stuff that they had wasn't the greatest, but every now and then you'd find a gem like this. Now this is this is one of those Firebrand guitars, and it's all walnut. And somebody obviously didn't like the poopy brown colored natural finish that was on it, and decided to give it this not too bad, pretty good sparkle black finish. And it was really cool. And this is the original pickup. I believe these are T-tops. Let me know in the comments if I'm incorrect. But then it had a George Lynch Screaming Demon pickup in the bridge, which is a pickup I actually like. It's not a super hot pickup. It's more of a slightly hotter PAF style pickup, and they sound good. So I've left it just as I bought this guitar. Everything else appears to be stock. It's got the same tuners on it. Now, the thing that is weird, and maybe if there's anybody out there that knows these guitars, the Firebrand, I've never seen one with this little inlay and the kind of the high-end inlay on the headstock. So if anybody out there knows, these guitars were built in Nashville And no telling, this could have been an employee's guitar that somebody refinished. I mean, I don't know. But it's a super cool guitar. It came with the original case. And I got it for, I think it was around 500 or 600 bucks. So that is a steal. Now, granted, because it's a refin, it doesn't have as much value as a one if it was, a mint condition original. But I think these are probably only going for $1,000 now. And so I don't know if it's really much of a loss, but I like this crazy finish on this. I mean, I can't lie and say that if I had been able to do this, I had a Gibson the Paul, which was a preliminary model to the Firebrand, and it was similar looks. It had that brown natural stain look, and it was my first good guitar. It was a Gibson the Paul, and so when I saw this, it kind of it struck my sentimentality, I thought, this is cool, and it's been modified with this cool finish, and it's got a Screaming Demon, which at the time I really liked these pickups, and so I was like, oh, I gotta buy this. So this is a guitar that I found in a pawn shop. Now, let me also tell you that I worked in a pawn shop in Los Angeles from approximately about 87 to maybe 89, 90, somewhere around then. And so I have a lot of experience with pawn shops. Now, pawn shops used to be the only place that you could really go and try and find some crazy deals on guitars. And, once pawn shop dealers got a hold of Blue Book and they were able to look up values, and then, that started, the guitar thing, with back in the 80s, I mean, you could still get Les Pauls for pretty cheap, on the used side. But, the prices started creeping up, and pawn shops started becoming more aware of, what things were worth. And in general, when I worked at Brothers Collateral in Hollywood, right there on Melrose, and generally guitars were $100 loan. That was what they were willing to give for a guitar. And for that $100 loan, they would get 3 months to pay it back. And after that 3 months, they had to come in and pay interest on the loan in order to keep it there, or pay the full amount back plus the interest, and then they could get their instrument back. But, inevitably, some people don't come back. And, as a worker in a pawn shop and as a customer in a pawn shop, I've lost guitars in pawn shops. I have bought guitars in pawn shops. I've scored crazy deals in pawn shops. And I've gotten some not so great deals in pawn shops. So, it's one of those things, it seems like now, and I will say this, because that same pawn shop, Brothers Collateral, it was open for a long time after I worked for it. And the brothers that ran that place ran it great. And, I have a lot of fond memories of working in the pawn shop and some of the great musicians. I mean, we had musicians from the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Earth, Wind and Fire and Phil Collins, and all these people would come in and pawn their stuff. Not Phil Collins personally, but people from his band. And some of them so much so that it became difficult to keep track of the inventory that they had in there. But, pawn shops, people think, oh, everything in a pawn shop is stolen. That's not the case. Pawn shops have to take in the serial numbers, a detailed description of the instrument, and those each week were handed over to the local detective, who would then enter it in the system. And if something came back stolen, then they would come and say, hey, we got a hit on this. we got to take this. And so, the pawn shop would be out there $100 or whatever if a guitar came back, kind of weird. And I've got a lot of crazy stories from my time in the pawn shop, so I'll save that for another time. But pawn shop guitars, to me, have a certain appeal. And I believe it was David Lee Roth that said, a blues guitar never sounds good until it's been in and out of the pawn shop at least once. And, there is something to be said for that. I think the days of pawn shops and their integral part of, hey, if you're out of cash and you've got 3 or 4 guitars and you need $100 because you're hungry, I mean, those places provided a service, and it's a service I took advantage of and worked for at one point in time, and they're important. But I think now, and I noticed once eBay came, a lot of pawn shops, opened eBay stores, and people became very aware with the internet of what things were worth. And so the ability to get deals, in some cases, pawn shops overprice items. So you got to be aware of what something's worth. You got to be aware of what something's worth, and you can always go in and negotiate. There were times where I believe I bought a green GMP electric, or was it GMW or GMP? It was one of those custom brands out in California, and it was hanging on the walls. It was a really cool guitar, super heavy, but it had Duncan pickups in it and an ebony neck, and it was a really nice guitar. I took it to the Philippines and played it at Araneta Coliseum. But I basically went to him and said, "Look, you guys are trying to sell this for $1,000." I said, "Nobody in this area or in this town even knows what this guitar is." I said, "Look, I'll give you $700 and, I'll take it off your hands and you won't have to worry about it." And they said, "Yeah, you know what? You're right." So, you can negotiate, you can find some deals in pawn shops, and, they are still around. So pawn shops, you've got to be careful. You've got to know what things are worth. You've got to be able to negotiate. But, once eBay came along, and people being able to bid on things, that took away a lot of the show up and, offer them a few $100 kind of thing. And like I said, some pawn shops overprice their stuff. You go in, people think they're getting a deal, and you could have gone to the local guitar center. But, there's certain people that do most of their electronic shopping and things like that at a pawn shop because it's in their neighborhood, and they're used to dealing with them. They come in there, they do business, and then they get a little extra money and they get their stuff out of pawn and say, "Hey, I need a new TV, give me a deal on this." And so, they have their clientele. Once eBay and Reverb now, are a thing, and Facebook Marketplace, it's less likely that a musician is going to, at least a young musician, is going to go to a pawn shop. I think the days of pawn shops are, there are fewer and fewer of them. And I do know Brothers Collateral, my old pawn shop I worked at, they have sold the property, they have closed the doors, they're retired, and, they did very well with that business. But still, the glory of going through pawn shops and finding gems like this, and, a guitar like this, it's got a funky, nasty sort of vibe. So the track that I played on at the beginning of the video, it almost reminds me of how I had to play in the 90s when I would play on a rock demo or play with a rock band and some of the projects that I worked on. I had to throw all that 80s stuff away and pretend like I couldn't play, or I couldn't, so there were times in the video where I wanted to just, rip a little bit more, but I thought, what, stylistically, I played for the song. And that is another thing that I often say. Sometimes a great guitar sound is not the sound that's right for the song. So you can hear on this track. Now I used my Line 6 Pod Express to get the guitar sound, and I used the Crunch amp, but then I kicked in the fuzz pedal to give it that nasty, squashy, lo-fi sort of distorted sound, and it worked perfectly for this track and this song, and it's fitting for pawn shop guitars because, God bless the pawn shops. They kept many a musician from getting evicted, over the years. And, sometimes you lose guitars. I've lost some nice guitars in pawn shop, and I've gotten some nice guitars and amps and things like that in pawn shops. So God bless them. I hope they stick around. They are a necessary service, but I think now in the modern day and age, you're going to see less and less pawn shops because people are able to sell their goods on their own. So if you have a local pawn shop, why don't you take a trip down today and see if you can't find yourself a pawn shop guitar. I'm Bad Brad. Thanks so much for watching my video, and I'll see you on the next one.